Hey guys, welcome back to more Sovereign Radio here at Modular Summit. I'm here with Huang from Conduit, co-founder, CEO. What do you prefer?
CEO.
CEO,
Founder.
CEO, founder. I'm Hart Lamber, co-founder of Across Protocol and part-time podcast host in this series. Andrew, let's go into quickly your origin story. How did you get to Conduit and this idea?
For sure. Well, one, thanks for having me, Hart. Excited to be here. Prior to starting Conduit, I was an engineer in Web 2. And so I had worked at this company called Wish, which is like e-commerce mobile shopping app. You might have purchased some really cheap items from there. But they're famous for just scaling really quickly. So a great place to learn the infrastructure, how to scale things. And then I joined Paradigm as an EIR like towards the end of 22. And kind of targeting infrastructure times crypto problems. And, I followed obviously during the bull and, a lot of activity, a lot of money flowing through the system, still very constrained on compute. And so it kind of felt like in order to sustain that demand, or at least give more supply, right, of compute, we needed better infrastructure. And, navigated the maze. I think where you kind of end up landing is that rollups are kind of the way to securely scale crypto compute.
Yep.
Like you might do a side chain, but people don't want to bridge over. You might do an ephemeral rollup, but there aren't a ton of use cases today. Really what you want is a secure way of interoperating with Ethereum and doing that kind of off-chain compute. And it was at that time we kind of realized that one, the OP stack was kind of coming to fruition, open source with kind of the Bedrock stuff. Obviously followed that up with kind of the Arbitrum Orbit and the Arbitrum Nitro stack. And so it's kind of been off to the races and giving, I think, developers a primitive that has been sorely needed.
So you're kind of like a modular stack poster child in the sense that you're like modular stack is your take on how to scale compute.
100%. I think we're a great poster child. I think initially we were very kind of Ethereum aligned,
Yep.
and there were certainly skeptical takes around some of the modular stuff. But
Yep.
I think very quickly, just the economics of the modular stuff really made rollups accessible in a way that Ethereum at the time was not. I think. We actually just launched, not blobs. You've probably seen rollup.wtf.
Yep.
We launched the blob/DA version of that chart. And if you look at the cost ranking right now, blobs are actually free on Ethereum. And so kind of the cheapest data source today. Obviously, as that finds price discovery, will kind of go up. But Celestia is kind of next with EigenDA and some of the other options. And so it's been interesting to see kind of that cost performance ratio kind of over time and how that's enabled like many different types of rollups and even things like layer 30s.
Yeah, I got some data for you on like sort of what we've seen post Dencun too, which you can get into. But before we go too deep, let's make sure we get everybody on the same page with what Conduit is. Give me the 2-second pitch on what Conduit is and where you think it's going.
Yeah, so Conduit is AWS for crypto. So we're a rollup native cloud platform. And we think, rollup is the new server. And so there's a lot of infra companies out there. I think traditionally it's only been like read APIs and not actually scaling compute.
Yep.
We think it's an entirely different kind of vertical. And so.
Yeah. That's how I thought you were going to describe it. And I'll just repeat it back because I think it's such a clear, like crisp image. This idea that I go to Conduit, I pick my VM, whether it's like EVM or SVM or whatever. I pick my stack. I pick OP stack, Orbit, ZK Sync. I pick my DA layer and I hit like deploy. And that to me is such a crisp, clear like product offering. And when I first heard this, I was the one thinking, okay, yeah, this does make the compelling argument that running your own rollup can be equivalent to running your own server, which is also really cool. And I want to actually ask you about later how that kind of evolves. So, cool. Okay, so that's Conduit. How do you think, because there are other rollup as a service providers, to ask you the annoying question, like how do you differentiate yourself or what's the value add?
Totally. I think each roll-up as a service in the market is kind of carving out its own niche. I'd say ours is really, what's underrated is the operation, maintenance, and like upgrading of these roll-up frameworks. And so I think deployment is a commodity. I think anybody can kind of run some scripts, get something spun up. I think it's the entire life cycle and journey with the customer. We say roll-up is the server, but the probably correct definition is like a database. And so like as you add more and more data to this database, it gets harder and harder to migrate out. And that's why the decision of who you go with isn't kind of a 3 to 6 month decision and kind of a rip and replace. It's like, I'm going with this provider and I'm probably going to be with them for many, many years. And so I think kind of our reliability, our performance, our stability, and just the customer set that we have today that is really pushing the limits of kind of the roll-up frontier of what's possible means that we can build really cool features and then kind of integrate those back into the product and instantly distribute that to any customer. And so if I was kind of a team looking for a roll-up provider, I'd want to be on the one that all the best customers are going to in the same way that many go to AWS today.
Okay, got it. So premium roll-up as a server or roll-up as a database, which makes sense. But I guess to extend that analogy too and kind of talk about where this goes, like you were saying, okay, so if this is AWS for rollups, you start with the rollup itself, but then you're going to want to add services in the same way AWS started with like EC2 and I forget what their storage is called right now, but
S3.
Yeah, S3, and kept adding more and more services. So I know you guys, like, what's that look like in your world? Like, what do you think are the other services rollups need to be successful?
100%. So one, I think it's probably not going to be possible for us to build every single thing here. So that's why we recently launched or announced the Conduit marketplace. And so the idea is on any new chain, you're going to need a bunch of tooling, and you ideally want kind of the best-in-class services. So a great example here is like every chain needs a fast bridge, across great fast bridge. Yeah. And so imagine one-click adding across to your rollup is a really powerful way to immediately get access to that. We're working with great partners like Dune, Tenderly, indexers like GoldSky, and I think it's increasingly representing an opportunity for us to build additional products and services and distribute it through that marketplace. And
yeah, like the Dune thing I saw. So like now any Conduit rollup will have like Dune Analytics day one, basically.
So if the customer opts into it, okay, they can have it on day one.
Yeah, cool. And yeah, back on across, our goal is to be like the day one fast bridge on all these stacks. And I do think this is the cool modular world that I would see coming, where you run your rollup. It's the new server. You run your rollup as a new server. You get these day one services that you can do useful things on, and you have like no code experience to create and launch these things. That seems cool. But I guess to kind of like play it forward too, I'm quite curious, and I think there's a lot of like fuzzy unknowns around what a world of 1,000, 10,000, or 1 million rollups might look like.
Yeah.
And I think it's always quite fun to talk to informed people in the space and get their predictions and hypotheses for what will these rollups be used for? What does that kind of market structure look like? Is it going to be like a handful of major rollups that have a lot of apps on them? Or are we going to have this like app chain thing where each app is their own rollup? Or is this a bit of both? Like, we don't know yet, but what are you thinking?
Yeah, I'm definitely not Nostradamus here, but I think we'll see a variety. And I think on Conduit today, we see definitely the ecosystem approach. So how do I build out an ecosystem? How do I make sure my rollup has all of the integrations necessary to support that? And then my business model is going to be sequencer revenue. I think probably the best examples of this are like Base and Arbitrum one, right? But we have a couple on Conduit, like a mode network or something like that. In my opinion, I think basically it depends on the scalability limit of these rollups, right? Base has been continuously pushing up the gas limit. If there's some sort of vertical scalability limit there, you're by necessity going to need many different settlement or ecosystem layers, right, for that demand or activity to leak out into.
Yeah.
The other way I kind of think about it is what differentiates an ecosystem, and if they're all kind of relatively the same, then maybe just load balance between them. And I even think beyond that, really, I think applications taking off and making unique use of their block space is going to be the way forward for many teams. And I think only so many people can play the ecosystem game. There's only one Coinbase. There's only one Jesse Pollak. And so I think for most people, it'll be what uniquely can I build on my chain? If I'm on my own chain, how do I utilize all of that block space? Right. So, for example, we have this great game called Proof of Play, Pirate Nation, if you've heard of them.
Yep.
They're doing 40 million gas a second, which is 20 times Ethereum, 5 times base. And they have 100K DAUs, 5,000 concurrents. And Pirate is the only coin that's been up in this market. So I think once you start really embracing that as a server and kind of that amount of compute lifting constraints that maybe people's mental models previously had, I think you can start to build some really cool stuff.
Going back to the base example for a second, because to me it's quite interesting where, okay, so base is hitting the limits of what you can do on a roll up, and they're going to keep pushing that for a while. Coinbase obviously wants to keep everybody on base, or I would think they want to keep people on base because they earn sequencer revenue, plus they kind of just have more control, if you will. But then at some point, the biggest applications, they'd also be like, well, I want my own sequencer revenue, and or I maybe can't get the performance or the low gas costs I want on this platform. And so, but then migrating off is quite difficult too. So I don't know, do you have any thoughts on like, in that, do you think some of these larger roll-ups might be like launch pads for app chains to kind of spin off into, or?
I think that's exactly right. I think if you think the original spin-offs were like Optimism and Arbitrum, I think we'll continue to see that kind of, I don't want to use the word fragmentation, but kind of evolution, if you will. And so what we see, Base has the most L3s out of any roll-up. And I think, you can start on Base, and then if you have an L3 settling to Base, it's a lot easier to then migrate kind of your state, right? And so I think the demand leaking out into these L3s is kind of an evolutionary path forward that we see for a lot of applications that start on a shared layer. Obviously, it's easier. And then once you kind of hit escape velocity, and the fact of the matter is for any kind of settlement layer, it's one size fits all. And it's, in some sense, yes, a rollup is modular. It's also monolithic in the sense that you have many different customers of that rollup. And so you can't optimize too heavily for any particular use case. Whereas on your own rollup, you can obviously make a lot of customization and kind of push the frontier just for your app. And so I think for that reason alone, there's a lot of reasons, good reasons to kind of launch your own chain.
This is kind of actually a different take than I've heard on like the L2, L3 thing in a bit, because the L3 thing felt a little foreign to me, but hearing you describe it here, it feels like it gives that application almost like max flexibility to do their own thing in the future, because they can kind of change their settlement point. What's your takes on like the L3 thesis? Do you think that's going to be growing, and like have you been seeing that at Conduit?
The L3 thing has definitely been growing. I would say its moment in the sun was, I think, when we launched Base L3s with the Base team back in March. And so we saw a huge kind of flood of demand. I actually think very quickly they started raising the gas limit. And so that kind of calmed some of it down. But as we're hitting congestion again on Base, as they continue to expand, and as more cool stuff gets built on chain, it's just such a natural release valve for that demand that we're still getting a ton of L3s. And I would say today, numbers wise, it's not 50-50 yet, but I would say big portion, maybe like 30% and growing quickly, are L3s versus L2s.
Okay, last thing to touch on, like interop. So in this world of all these chains, I mean, I care a lot about this with like across, but how do you think we navigate this, right? So it's like, in my mind, this is the core trade-off of the modular thesis of like, okay, great, we have all these, we have more compute because we've isolated these roll-ups or these state machines. but now we have to connect them. And yeah, I don't know. Do you have any like high level hot takes on what interop will look like?
I don't know if I have any hot takes. I think zooming out, I kind of think fragmentation isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think I've used this term before, but like vestigial overhang of you need to max composability at all times. I think if you look at Web 2, like Facebook and Instagram and Google, they don't necessarily compose that often, and you have well-defined paths for the data that does, right? And so I think if you look at interoperability in a many-chain world, it's unclear to me that somebody playing Pirate Nation needs to arb some MBV on base in the same kind of atomic transaction. I think the key thing is really making sure that you can use the chain, right? So if I'm on chain A, I want to interact on chain B, that should be seamless. And I think that's where protocols like a cross come in, where you can kind of make that seamless with some of the interop stuff. And I think that's kind of the end game.
You know, you might not think it's a hot take, but I think it is actually kind of a hot take, one that I very much agree with, but I keep quiet. Composability, I think, was overhyped in DeFi 1.0. And people thought this is just this thing you need. It's this amazing quality that a single blockchain gives you. I fully agree when you look at like Web 2 apps, they don't talk to each other. Because but they could. There just hasn't really been much need to. And so I don't know, this does fit into like my own thinking where the most important thing you need for interoperability is the seamless way to move value to be able to like bridge swap and call, like bridge assets, bridge value to chains, maybe swap from one asset to another, but basically so you have gas money to do the action on your chain. So I think I agree with you, but I think it is a space to take.
I think maybe the other way to look at it is composability kind of inherently means like maybe they should be one app. It also means it's pretty easy to get commoditized,
Yeah.
right? So I think trying to build a protocol or an app that isn't as composable is in some ways like very differentiated.
Very cool. All right, I think we gotta wrap this up. But if people want to hear more about Conduit, if they want to launch their own rollup, where do they go? What do they do?
Yeah, go to conduit.xyz and our Twitter, conduitxyz as well.
Cool. Thank you so much, man.